City Club of Portland's Friday Forum. I'm Courtney Nelson, president of City Club. For 100 years, City Club of Portland is where civic-minded people come together to make Portland and Oregon a better place for everyone to live, work, and explore. We're gathered at the Sentinel Hotel today, along with all of you listening on OPB or viewing on Portland Community Media or YouTube. The generous support of City Club's corporate sponsors and media sponsors enables us to put on the state's best civic programs week after week. Our media partner is Oregon Business Magazine, and our current Friday Forum sponsors are Chevron Corporation, Echo Northwest, Morel Inc., Northwest Natural, and Vacasa Vacation Rentals. Please join me in showing our appreciation for all of them. In the past week, the tragic circumstances surrounding the violence in Baton Rouge, Minneapolis, and Dallas have deeply affected all of us. As we collectively grapple with the circumstances surrounding these senseless acts of violence, I would like to ask us to take a moment of silence. Let us take this moment to remember the victims and demonstrate in our hearts the sentiments of love, compassion, and kindness for their families as we confront this defining issue of our time. We will be devoting our last Friday Forum of the month to this topic, and we hope that you'll join us on July 29th. Moving on to today's program, our topic is When Oregon Got Politics Right, with legendary Oregon political reporter and TN news analyst Floyd McKay, author of Reporting the Oregon Story. Oregon entered a new era in 1964 with the election of Tom McCall as Secretary of State and Bob Straub as State Treasurer. Their political rivalry formed the backdrop for two of Oregon's most transformative decades. And as they successfully fought for, lost, and won the governorship, veteran Oregon journalist Floyd McKay had a front row seat. In addition to Floyd as our panelist today, he's the author of Reporting the Oregon Story, How Activists and Visionaries Transformed a State. We also have with us Representative Lou Frederick of Oregon House District 43, and Representative Alissa Keny-Guyer of Oregon House District 46. Our moderator is Tracy Berry of KGW News. A little background on our panelists. Floyd McKay is a longtime Oregon and Northwest journalist and historian, and the author of Reporting the Oregon Story, How Activists and Visionaries Transformed a State. Portland audiences will remember him from his work as news analyst and commentator at KGW TV from 1970 to 1986. McKay began reporting the Oregon politics in 1964 for the Oregon Statesman, now the Statesman Journal, in Salem, the same year that Tom McCall and Bob Straub won their first statewide offices. Representative Alissa Keny-Guyer has spent over 35 years working to eliminate poverty, promote cross-cultural understanding, invest in youth, protect the environment, and promoting civil rights. She was appointed to represent House District 46, which covers part of Southeast and Northeast Portland, in 2011. Our Representative Lou Frederick has represented North and Northeast Portland and the legislature since 2009, and he looks forward to representing the larger Senate district starting in 2017. His professional background includes 17 years as a television reporter with Channel 8 KGW. And our moderator today, Tracy Berry, can be seen weeknights anchoring KGW News, which she joined in 1985. In 2011, Tracy was honored at her alma mater to be inducted into the Hall of Achievement of the Edward R. Murrow College of Communication at Washington State University. Get a little go Cougs there, yeah. So thank you for being with us today, and Tracy, turning it over to you.
Oh my gosh, already? Yeah, so clearly I started my career at the age of 11. It was very unusual. I'm so pleased to be here today. And I do want to remind everyone, you know I love station breaks, commercials, everything of that nature, that for those of you listening on OPB, you were listening to the City Club of Portland's Friday Forum. I'm Tracy Berry of KGW News, and we are discussing Floyd McKay's new book, Reporting the Oregon Story, along with Floyd McKay, Representative Lou Frederick, and Representative Alissa Keny-Guyer. And Floyd, we are hoping that you will share with us a little overview of the book before we begin to grill you for all the juicy details.
Thank you, Tracy. It's wonderful to see such a group of Portlanders here. It's been a long time since I've spoken to the Portland City Club. I'm glad to see you're now welcoming women members. The spirit of Gretchen Kafori is in the house. The activism that led the City Club to widen its membership was typical of what was going on during the period of time that I call the Oregon Story era, 1964 to 1986. And this idea, the activists of the City Club movement, if you will, they were insistent, they were organized, and they were led by women. This is typical of what was going on during this period of time in which the subtitle of my book is How Activists and Visionaries Transformed the State. This was typical of the activism, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. That's the subtitle of the book. It's my attempt to expand the narrative a bit beyond the usual Tom and Bob story, although we all love those stories, and I certainly do some of that in the book. Traditionally, the Oregon story is defined as the beach bill, open beaches belong to the people, no highways on them. The bottle bill, recycling, kind of putting Oregon in the national headlines. The land use laws that are still looked at today as a model for the entire country. And the cleanup and protection of the Willamette River. My book adds a couple of chapters to that normal list of Oregon Story achievements. One of them is the Columbia Gorge Scenic Area, which was the last act, if you will. And I talk about the remarkable role of Nancy Russell, one of the interesting activists of that time. Most importantly, I think I've added a chapter that I call the Portland Renaissance. Simple fact of the matter is that the Oregon story would not have been complete without laying the foundations for the very interesting and exciting city that we have today in Portland. And they were actually linked at the very onset. The very first chapter in my Oregon story accounting, if you will, was 1965, when a bunch of beach homeowners got going against a highway on the beach at Pacific City. And they got some other people engaged in them, including Bob Straub and Janet McLennan, who was one of the prominent activists of the time. That was the first big story in the Oregon story, as I account it. It was one of the few in which Tom McCall was caught out on the other side, and that all had to do with the relationship with the powerful Glenn Jackson, the chairman of the Highway Commission. And I talk quite a bit in the book about that relationship. It was the first time that we really began to look at the power of the Highway Commission and who ought to be controlling some of these decisions. And that then links directly into Portland, because by the time I got to Portland in 1970, we were already fighting urban freeway wars. The first one was Harbor Drive, and some of you may remember that battle. They wanted to build, they being the Highway Commission and a lot of other powerful players, wanted to build a freeway between the city and its waterfront. Today, that would be a no-brainer for us. At that point, the powers were lined up for it. And a bunch of people got together and formed a neighborhood organization that then became a citywide organization. And they started pushing back on City Hall. City Hall had people who were interested in this sort of thing. And there was an emerging group of urban planners, a lot of them associated with Portland State University and its moving into urban policies. And they pushed back. The second big one, and this was really the big one, was the so-called Mount Hood Freeway. No, it didn't go to Mount Hood. It didn't even come close to Mount Hood. It was a great title. An organization calling itself Sensible Transportation Options for People, STOP, wonderful acronym, and it really worked, began organizing against this Mount Hood Freeway. And at this time, McCall and Straub were on the same side. They were joined by Neil Goldschmidt, Don Clark, and some other leaders. And most of all, they were joined by people who began networking and working in a very cooperative way all across the city. Well, we won those battles. We won them all. Amazing. Pioneer Square came out of this, MAX and the whole transportation system, downtown revival, housing, all of these things emerged primarily from the Mount Hood Freeway decision, because that was critical, but from all the stuff that was going on at that time. Bold leadership and vision was required, certainly, but there was also an enormous need for people to keep the pressure on all the time, because these things were not a slam dunk. Every single chapter of the Oregon story had powerful opponents, both financial and political, and they needed help from all sorts. I got to get my notes straight here. There we go. Many of these activists and visionaries were not native Oregonians. There was a period of time here that a lot of young people, young families were moving into Oregon because they saw this as a place that something good could be done, something big could be done. You know, I have a hunch that this idea that people moving here sometimes are even better at preserving the things that we have than the people who've lived here a long time, because we have a tendency to take them for granted. I see that even in the town where we're now living, Bellingham, Washington. I note with some interest that my legislative friends here, Alissa and Lou, neither were born in Oregon, and not close enough. And I think there's a lot more of that going on. There was a core of Portland activists, particularly women that we later came to call trailing spouses. These were young, educated, smart, and ambitious women who simply, at that point in time, 60s and 70s, didn't have the opportunities to pursue those graduate degrees and everything because of the hiring practices of the day. And they were deeply involved in these things. And they were a big part of what I call the activist part of it. I think we also need to remember that everything that was done here was done in the shadow of a national, what was almost a national tragic era. We had assassinations, we had riots, we had Vietnam, we had civil rights. All of these things were going on at the same time, and these people were working away kind of underneath the next layer down and transforming their local community while the national story was pulling people apart. Well, the Oregon story was really built in 2 decades, 1 generation. Interestingly enough, it was built by people who knew the Depression and World War II, one or in some cases both. And one of the messages, or one of the lessons that came out of growing up in that period of time and going through some of those experiences and knowing that, people saw government as a force for good. After all, the New Deal had stopped the Depression. American forces had won World War II, and so they saw it as positive. But by 1980, many of these people were worn out, tired. The economy had gone a little soft, and they began turning away and taking for granted some of these things. Then we had the Reagan Revolution, in which, in the first inaugural, the new president said, "Government is not the solution to our problem, government is the problem." Probably one of his most famous quotes. And In many ways, this epitomized almost the exact opposite of what we were doing in Oregon, because we had used government and governmental leaders to accomplish these community goals. There was an irony in this. One of the few environmental gains during the Reagan administration was the Columbia Gorge Scenic Area. And it was totally antithesis to the Reagan administration and to the president in particular. Ironically, it was accomplished largely through the leadership and intervention of that dying breed called liberal Republicans in the Northwest, Senators Mark Hatfield, Bob Packwood, and Dan Evans of Washington. Well, with it all came the beginning of the great divide in our politics today. And there's a certain amount of difference between then and now, and I think it's important that we do remember this as we celebrate our heritage. 50 years ago, we dealt largely with the natural environment and with man-made change to the natural environment. The Oregon story: beaches, rivers, mountains, and trails, and saving that heritage from bad decisions, either in the governmental or the private sector. We saved these landmarks from decisions that were short-sighted by highway builders, developers, and industrial polluters. We could work together. We faced common threats. All of these changes affected everyone who lived in a given neighborhood, a given town, and of course a given state. There was no bipartisanship to air pollution. There was no bipartisanship to no partisanship, excuse me, to running a freeway through a residential area. Republicans and Democrats lived side by side in those neighborhoods. They all breathed the same air. We all recognized that the Willamette River was beginning to smell. So we could work together to face common threats. Today's challenges, I think, and I would hope that my colleagues on the stage will talk about this more because they are better equipped to do so. Today's challenges involve social changes and transformations of a different nature. They're deeply embedded with race, gender, religion, immigration, and they're full of passion and they're full of anger. And it is much harder to negotiate a hot-button issue like that than the sort of things that we typically negotiated in the 60s and 70s. So I just leave you with those thoughts, and I'm looking forward to discussion with the others on the panel.
Thank you so much. And Floyd alluded to it, but how pleased we are to have with us today two names also very connected to the Oregon story. Senator Bob Packwood and Elaine Franklin is here as well. Please welcome them. You may not know Elaine Franklin as well as the media does, but we didn't get to talk to Bob Packwood without going through Elaine Franklin. And I will tell you, it was not easy. But we're so glad that you could be here today. Thank you for joining us as well. You know, I kind of just passed paths a little bit with Floyd at KGW. I think we were there for about a year. And he was kind of a big deal, all right? I was very intimidated, you know. Hi, Mr. McKay. But Lou was not in that position. You had a much different relationship with Floyd than I did. Talk a little bit about working together at KGW, if you don't mind.
Well, thank you, Tracy. I was lucky enough. I came in as, at that time, the youngest reporter at Channel 8 in 1977. And it was clear that I didn't know what I was doing. So I ended up relying on talking with as many people as possible. And they would send me out on a story, on a political story or a community story of some form. And I would come back and I would write it, and then there would be something that doesn't happen that much anymore in the newsroom. There would be editors and other reporters who would come by and say, you know, you might want to check on this. Floyd was one of those people who would come and say to me, did you talk with so-and-so? Have you had a chance to say, to call this person? Did you know that this had taken place? To help give me context. And that happened throughout the time he was at Channel 8, and even after he was at Channel 8. He would, every once in a while, he would say, you know, you might want to look at this situation. And that's what it became. It became, for me, essentially a mentorship, to be able to get a sense of how I might tell the story better and who was involved. So I enjoyed that quite a bit.
Did you think he had any hope at all, Floyd? Was it, you know?
Be honest.
Lou was very green, but he had what it took. He was smart and he was dedicated, and those things will overcome lack of experience every day. And it was a wonderful thing. We had a bunch of young reporters during that time, and a lot of them turned out really well. And it was a great pleasure to work with them. I think they all came to me because I kept this huge filing cabinet of stuff. When I moved from Salem to KGW, I brought 2 filing cabinets full of notes and clippings and every other darn thing, and I kept traveling with them. I traveled when I left KGW. I cleaned out the newsroom, and I think the institutional memory went with me.
Well,
but they wound up in Bellingham, and now they wound up in this book.
Oh, Dixie, I bet you were so happy that all of that moved to Bellingham, right? Sure, honey, let's put that in the garage, right? I know. We'll get to you in just a minute, Alissa, but I have to share with you this one thing that I read in Floyd's book because it was so delightful. You know, we think so much has changed since 1960. This is how he described TV news in 1960. He was a newspaper reporter then. Our image was that of a smooth and inoffensive anchorman, a fast-talking jock, an entertaining weatherman. 56 years later, so much has changed, and yet, so much hasn't. Alissa, when I look at your very impressive resume, and I was listening to Floyd talk just then, I thought, that's you. You are the activist. You are the person who came to Oregon willing to change things, willing to jump in on so many different areas and then become, you know, a lawmaker, to go to the legislature. Certainly not a job for the faint of heart. How has your 5 years been there? What's your takeaway for Oregon?
Well, first of all, I'm really delighted to be here and see so many people in the audience that were part of creating this story. And I feel very much like we are building on the backs of all the good work of so many people here. I also want to recognize Lou Frederick, who is a colleague of ours. Lou Frederick, I'm sorry. Yeah, Jeff Reardon, who's a colleague of ours. Any
It's
other
the nose we
state?
looked at.
Yeah, you look a lot alike. Any other state legislators here? Okay, well, thank you, Jeff, for joining us. So I wanted to say that there were so many themes that were brought, that Floyd shared with us here, and also I read in the book before coming here, that actually echo a lot with what I see today. You know, you were talking about the era in which this Oregon story took place the backdrop was the Vietnam War, and how unique the leadership that Oregon had on a national stage with Senator Morse and Senator Hatfield, a Democrat and a Republican, coming together to very early on to oppose the Vietnam War, and how that really put Oregon on the stage, in addition to a lot of the bills that Democrats and Republicans came together around the bottle bill and the beach bill and the land use bills and the things that really do make Oregon very different. And that's a really proud history for us. But I also thought that it was interesting in your book that there was actually also a lot of political bickering, both between parties and within parties. And so sometimes I think we glorify that, and when we are having those fights now, I think, oh, how do we get back to a different era? But I think there's some common themes that actually are continuing. And the kinds of protests that are happening today, certainly there are some around international and the wars and things like that. But I think one of the really big, there's two big things that I would say are emerging issues that we as decision makers and activists are really reacting to. Some of that is climate change. This was not as much on the radar back when we were looking at preserving our natural resources, but now it's very much on the radar. And I'm very proud that Oregon has taken a lead nationally in this arena. We passed the Clean Fuels bill a couple of years ago to reduce our transportation fuel, carbon fuels, and then more recently our coal to clean legislation, where we are the very first state to say we're going to phase out the use of coal. So yay for Oregon for continuing that tradition. And the other thing I'll just mention, and I think we'll get into it, I don't want to take too much time now, but I hope we get into it, is our growing disparity, our income and asset disparity. This has really been growing since the 80s. We've had a divestment in housing. We've had from the federal government. We've had increasing gaps in home ownership has been reduced. Wages have not been able to keep up. And so that is another thing in which Oregon has really taken the lead on a number of fronts. One of the first states to pass a retirement security bill, a minimum wage bill, a bereavement bill, a paid sick leave bill. And the rest of the country is really looking at us as being very innovative and taking very strong steps to try to close these gaps. And these gaps, the economic and racial gaps that we have that are leading to the tragedies that we have seen recently in the news and that have been building and building and building, are things that, that we absolutely have to take care of, and I think Oregon is taking a lead.
I just want to remind the folks listening on OPB that you're listening to the City Club of Portland's Friday Forum. I'm Tracy Berry of KGW News. We're discussing Floyd McKay's new book, Reporting the Oregon Story, along with Floyd McKay, Representative Lou Frederick, and Representative Alissa Keny-Guyer. Alissa, you touched on something, because I, too, thought that the good old days, everybody was nice to each other, and then I read the book. Oh, my. I couldn't believe it. Okay, Wayne Morris picked on Mark Hatfield. Mark Hatfield picked on Tom McCall. Everybody picked on everybody. They fought a lot, and it was not that nice at all when you hear the stories. So, but Floyd, you said, yeah, but in the end, they all kind of made up and moved on.
People were able to talk to their opponents in those days, in part because there was not a strong party, what the national politicians would call a party whip business, where people were required by their party affiliation to vote a certain way, whether they liked it or not, and that's what we see going on in Congress right now. We did not have that type of system in the Oregon legislature, although the parties were at equality during most of this period of time. The House in particular changed from Democrat to Republican in 1965 and was Republican through 1971 legislature, and then it switched over and went Democratic, and the Senate was too complex for me to describe in the time here. But people were able to work with each other in a bipartisan way. Some of the people who served at that time felt that it was because they didn't have large staffs at that time. Basically, every legislator had one assistant. Quite often, with the male legislators at least, it was his spouse. And the desks... How
adorable.
The desks at that time on the floor of the House and the Senate were also their offices. In the mid-'70s, when they built the new wings, they also added new staff. Doors were closed that were once open, and the circulation of people with members of the other party declined to some degree. It's so important that legislators, I'm talking legislation now, I'm not talking about governors. Legislators really need to be able to find social occasions and other occasions when they can meet people without having to shout at each other's faces. And I think we need to find more of that. Certainly, God knows the U.S. Congress could use some of this.
Is that possible, you guys? I know there's like lobbyist rules and all kinds of things.
Well, I think there's also a problem that we have in that we actually don't shout at each other that much.
What?
No, I know. But part of the problem is that, in fact, our media now only deals with extremes. So you're not seeing the fact that we're actually talking with each other, that we're enjoying. Alissa is noted for being able to work with folks across the island and within the caucus in an extremely good fashion. She gets things accomplished. And it's not because we're shouting at each other. But you would never know that if you were reading the Oregonian or many of the other papers. Peter here today? There he is. Peter is one of the few reporters who actually gives context to what's really going on in Salem. And so what we see, what you see, is only the times when it's extremes that they're able to talk about. Unfortunately, as you know, KGW and the other 3 stations in Portland do not have bureaus in the basement of the Capitol anymore. So they only show up when they helicopter in to try to figure out what's going on based on a couple of paragraphs in the Oregonian. That's about it. So we don't have the kind of shouting and anger. We disagree on things, but that's what you only see. And so there's a belief that there's somehow this incredible antagonism daily there. That's not the case.
I did have a little idea on that. Because, you know, resources being what they are, I don't see a great change coming in that. There's so many other avenues now to get your message out. And you're so good at this, Lou. I think you should start your own little, like, legislative Facebook blog, newspaper. Take us into those hearings live on Facebook. I mean, there's so many ways to do it. I'm not kidding. I think it would be great. We're going to talk about this. We'll do it another time. But I think there's ways to do this.
But the real point is, and I think that it's a matter of context. One of the things that we did see were people working together, and you've got the context of people working together. And you didn't have, and one of the biggest issues we have right now in Oregon is the fact that most of the folks, as Tom McCall said to me, most of the folks in Portland no longer have relatives in the rest of the state. So there's not a sense that when you sit down at Thanksgiving dinner, you have Uncle George who's been working out as a logger, or somebody else who's fishing, or somebody else who's a wheat farmer. They are no longer there. So you don't have that connection. And as a result, you don't have just the familial sympathy that you might have otherwise.
Yeah, that connection, for sure.
Tracy, can I mention something?
Yeah, jump in.
Okay,
anytime.
this is on the question of the bipartisanship. I think another area where Oregon is a very strong leader and recognized for this nationally is in our health integration of mental health, dental health, physical health, our whole new coordinated care model. And we've already seen some tremendous gains in that, and we're one of the innovative, really the innovative states in this arena. Even though the website didn't work to get people covered, the healthcare delivery system is fundamentally changing, and a lot of that was the vision of Governor Kitzhaber, but it was also both parties. There were very, very strong bipartisanship, Representative Huffman and others from the Republican Party working with Democrats. So that's a very good example. I'd also say in the field of dental health, I'm on the healthcare committee, and I work with Representative Cedric Hayden from Grants Pass area, I believe. In mental health, that is certainly a very bipartisan issue. We are all touched by that issue. Toxics, trying to get toxic chemicals out of children's products. That was a bill that I had the honor of working on with Oregon Environmental Council, which again is a bipartisan environmental group with business people at the table. That was a bipartisan effort. We had 3 co-sponsors from Republicans, 3 from Democrats. We had a lot more Republicans than that voting for it. Not quite the same in the Senate. We always need an opportunity to put a little jab into the Senate there. Oh, yeah. Well, we'll expect that to change when Lou gets there. But these are things that did have bipartisan, and again, Oregon has the strongest children's toxic law in the country now. And I'm also pleased to say that we worked very closely with our federal delegation. And so Senator Jeff Merkley really took the lead in a bipartisan effort to reform the TSCA, the Toxic Substances Control Act, which was just passed by the House and the Senate. And this is the first major piece of environmental legislation at the national level in 25 years, and the first time under Republican Congress that EPA was given more tools to deal with reducing toxics. So I think a lot of that, again, was Oregon at the forefront and having a good partnership with our federal delegation.
But Floyd, you know, when I hear them talking about bipartisanship and the work between the two parties, and yet when I look at your book, and I read about the work between the governor and the Secretary of State and, you know, the work between the two parties then, I don't see that much of a two-party system still existing in Oregon in many ways.
I'm probably not the best person to comment on what the current situation is in Oregon, except I can read the names at the top of the ballot. And I think the Republican Party, basically since 1990, has basically lost its bench. What happened is in 1986, Norma Paulus was defeated. 1990, Dave Frohmeyer was defeated, and the heart went out of the moderate to liberal Republican Party. There was no one behind them. There was no bench. And the result is they haven't had what I at least would consider to be a first-rate candidate for governor, maybe not even for Secretary of State. I couldn't comment on that in all those years. And really, you need to have a governor to build other people within the party. Governors control a lot of appointments. They control a lot of the news. They control the budget that goes to the legislature, so many other things. And I think for a whole lot of reasons that I don't think anyone wants me to go into, the Republican Party right now is fairly moribund within Oregon. It's limited basically to rural and small town areas, and the demographics are moving against them very heavily and inexorably.
But it's not good for the state, I don't think, not to have that conversation, not to have that variety.
It's always good to have two strong parties. One of the reasons things worked during the Oregon Story period is because we did have two strong parties, and that in turn led to, I believe, better legislative candidates. You had to work hard to win those legislative races, and the party that was out was putting a lot of pressure on the party that was in. I think one-party control of the state is never a great idea, regardless of which party it is. But that's the way it is.
And besides, when the governor doesn't have anyone threatening them at all, they won't talk to the media. Just saying. Just saying, we can't get an interview at all.
I don't think it'd probably be a good idea for me to even try to talk about being challenged at this particular point. My race is, I'm officially gotten the Republican nomination as well as the Democratic nomination, as well as the Working Families Party, I hope, and the Independent Party. So.
And Lou, I know you will try to represent them
I've been
well.
trying to do that. I've been trying to do that. They haven't let me into the Republican caucus lately, but that's another story. I think, though, that we're also dealing with the fact that many of the folks do not, again, have the communication that used to take place. We simply don't have the knowledge of what's going on in Klamath Falls right now, or for that matter in Ontario or Burns. I mean, we got a lot more information about Burns in this year than we have in since I was probably at Channel 8, you know, when I was covering Burns quite a bit. But we simply haven't had that kind of coverage, and that's That's despite the fact that we probably have a greater chance of getting information, we just aren't going after it.
I would also say that just from an outsider's point of view, it doesn't seem that desirable to run for office. When I was reading Floyd's book, you mentioned that unless it was really a big deal, you know, politicians, you didn't really dig into every little tiny aspect of their personal life. They were allowed to have a personal life. That's just not the case anymore. Who wants to do that? It just doesn't seem like it would be that great of a gig.
There's so many hurdles today that are greater than at that time. One of the big ones is money. I mean, fortunes are spent on these races. Big money, and I know especially at the national level, but even look at contested legislative races, so much money, and you're right. There's a glare of publicity that probably didn't used to be quite as strong, although it's ironic that in the 60s, 70s, and this period where Oregon really had quite a strong local media. All three television stations, the Oregonian was still strong in those days. There were strong papers in Salem and Eugene, for instance. Now, not much strong anywhere. Portland has become a media desert almost. And yet, somehow people...
He means that in the nicest way, I'm sure. No, I'm teasing you, Floyd.
And meanwhile, people, I think, feel the intrusions, particularly of social media. There are no secrets from the cameras, no secrets from Facebook and Twitters and all the other things that go on these days. And a lot of people just don't want to expose themselves to that sort of thing. It's remarkable to me how many, what I perceive from the outside as being very strong legislators you have in this state at this time. I don't know anything really about the statewide elected officers. This is the first batch of statewide elected officers that I couldn't call people by first name, and I don't know these people anymore.
Well, you need to move back. That is my solution for that. But I mean, I do think it's true. I look at my teenage girls and I think, oh my gosh, thank heavens there weren't cell phones in my day, right? Oh man, it's just, there's no safe place. No safe place. When I was reading the book, one thing that struck me on the chapter, they were talking about the effort to block the nerve gas being moved from Japan, Okinawa, to Hermiston. And, well, some of the people in Hermiston were sort of, I don't know, right? They're used to having the toxic chemicals there. The more the state looked at it, the more they thought, you know what? This is not good for our state. We don't want this for our people. You're not going to bring that through. And they really stood up and took a stand about that. And, of course, what immediately popped into my mind, oil trains in the gorge. Now, I know they're already running, which is harder to put a stop to. But where's the leadership on that? I mean, is it possible for people to come together to look at that and maybe say, that's not what we want. We don't want a port in Vancouver. We don't want the trains in the gorge. You know, I'm not saying that's what they should say, but is it possible? Where is the leadership
It's very
today?
possible. And
Who are the leaders then that would do that?
And I think that you have a number of folks who have been right in front on that, as well as organizations. Many like what Floyd has talked about in the book. I mean, I've heard the activists.
I've heard the activists.
Yeah,
I haven't heard the leaders.
You haven't heard people speak about it, although they've been speaking about it, because the report, there's no, well, there are a couple.
Not true. We've covered that issue. I'm not buying it.
Then why haven't you come to talk?
I want to know who the state
why
leaders
haven't
are.
you come
Where's
to
the
talk?
governor?
Tracy,
Why aren't they in motion?
Tracy, there are a number of states representatives and senators who've been speaking about this for some time.
You need to talk louder then.
How loud do we need to speak? I mean,
Big groups.
that's the point. I mean, truly, there are folks who have been, I mean, we could go, there's a list of the Environmental Caucus in the Oregon House, in the Capitol, that has been talking about this for quite some time, putting out notices and letters and news releases and things like that that are not covered.
You're not going to cover a news release.
No, but I recognize that. But I mean, the fact is, the information is out there. It's not, we're not asking you to cover a news release. I recognize that that's the case. But the fact is, the information is out there, and it's being presented to who? Because you don't.
So there's going to be strong leadership that's actively, you think, coming together as a group to say no.
Yeah, I'll just say I think there is strong leadership. I know that Speaker Kotek and Representative Barbara Smith Warner, who had a bill to try to help the state prepare its first emergency responders to act in response to this kind of thing and be more prepared. I think one of the challenges, this is an interstate commerce issue, and the state has very limited ability to say, you may not bring this. Our ability is more, and so it's a very challenging, it requires activism at all different kind of levels to change some of the federal laws. We've made some progress, thank you to Representative Barbara Smith Warner and Speaker Kotek and others in the Environmental Caucus, which we are both a part of, in pushing this issue and related issues to this, the coal barges and others that come through the Columbia.
One of the things that I've done in my dotage has been to go back to reporting. And I've been writing for the last 4 years, I think, for a online news service coming out of Seattle called Crosscut. And my beat in the last 4 years has been oil trains, coal trains, and the fuel pipeline. And I'm happy to report that the activists are alive and well. Yes. When we started on this beat, there were about 6 of these coal export plans. There's, at this point, only 1 remaining, and I think the chances of that are somewhat slim. Basically, they've been shut down or cut back by citizen activists of the same type that kept the highways off the beaches, killed the Mount Hood Freeway, and so forth. So I think among the younger generation, the millenniums and the Gen Xers, if you will, there's an enormous interest. A lot of these people this year were feeling the burn, and I just hope that they don't flame out feeling the burn, and that they stick around and get into some of these things. But I think there's a very strong activist movement. And it got a lot of coverage, and it eventually accomplished what they wanted to accomplish, which I think in the long run is important to climate change. And I see the note saying Q&A.
It is. We're going to transition now. We're going to open the floor to questions. As a reminder, asking a question at the Friday Forum microphone is a benefit of City Club membership. If you are not a member, though, please write your question on an index card. Hold it up so that the City Club staff can collect it, and we'll try to get in some of those questions as well. And please ask a question. Don't make a statement. I don't know if you've seen me moderate any debates, but you know I'm mean. Seriously. I'm just like, yeah, what's your question? So just a little warning there. Okay, question time.
My name is Edward Hershey. I'm a City Club member. When my wife and I came here 11 years ago to take positions in higher education, we were very surprised and distressed at the state of public education in Oregon, and soon figured out that part of the problem was what I can call government by public referendum. Yet again, this time from the other side, we are about to see what probably will be the most expensive and perhaps vitriolic campaign in the history of the state over the gross tax proposal. Again, government, not by legislation, but by referendum. Is how big a problem has it been through all the era that it is so easy to get on the ballot and to effectively have this dialogue be not in the halls of the Capitol, but on television and in the newspapers through these referendum campaigns?
I want to make just one quick comment on that. The referendum system also reflects where the public's mood is at a given time. During the period of the Oregon story, 64 to 86, the use of the referendum and initiative was at the lowest level since it began in 1912. And the reason for it was that people thought they could get results from their elected officials, and they didn't need to go to the streets. And I think the more of those you see, the more it's an indication, it's a thermometer, if you will, of the public fever.
Can I try to answer that?
quickly.
Okay, so I just want to say, Ed, thank you for the question. One of the things is that we require a supermajority in the legislature to do any kind of revenue increase, and that is very hard. And it goes back to the question of why do we have such a bifurcated system right now? You might have moderate Republicans that recognize the need for revenue and want to be able to vote for it, but would be primaried. Just as we had Representative Jim Thompson was a Republican, moderate Republican, who worked very hard on our emerging healthcare integration, and also supported marriage equality. And he was primaried by somebody who did not agree with those positions. Those were the two positions that he ran on, and he lost the race. So those dynamics make it very hard for Republicans and Democrats to come together and debate and pass a revenue bill. And in my view, I don't think we're ever going to get significant revenue increase in the legislature because of those dynamics. And I think that Governor Kitzhaber tried to pull people together, Governor Brown has, and it hasn't gone anywhere. I think that's why we're in the state we are.
Jeff Carr, City Club member, and I want to thank you, Tracy, for the question about oil trains in the gorge. Very important question. And also, it's great to see Senator Packwood here. My question kind of gets to that. Floyd, could you talk a little bit more about how a very reluctant President Reagan was convinced to sign the Columbia Gorge Scenic Area Act, a greatly prized asset that we have now?
That was there's an interesting story there. The bill was passed through the Congress, and it had a period of time that the president either needed to sign it, or by not signing it was what was called a pocket veto. They were about a day away from this, and Bob, check me if I'm wrong on this, but the Senate delegations from the two states were working it hard, and several of the cabinet officers in Reagan's cabinet had called for a veto, including Don Hodel, who had been with the BPA and was a Portland guy, and he was Secretary of Interior at that time, or Energy, I can't remember which it was. And the story that I get is that it came down to the final quarters, and Hatfield picked up the phone and called Hodel, and worked Hodel over a little bit. We don't know what he said, but we do know that all budgets went through his committee, including Hodel's budget, and I suspect that Mark may have had something to do with Hodel's appointment to high positions. Hodel then, after the phone call, changed his mind, called Reagan and recommended that he sign the bill. The bill was duly signed. There's more to it, of course. That's all that I know.
City Club member. Floyd McKay, you now live in Washington State, a neighboring state that has a more robust Republican Party statewide than Oregon's. What's the difference between the two states?
I'm sure that my Republican friends in Washington would be pleased at the word robust. I'm not sure that I, however, would agree with that. You know, for many, I think that the Republican Party is in better shape in Washington than it is in Oregon. I'll tell you one of the major reasons is that the Republican side of the state, if you will, you know, we talk about the Cascade Curtain. The west side is predominantly Democrat and centered around the Puget Sound. The east side is primarily Republican. But the difference between the two states is in Washington, there are real urban centers. Spokane is a major urban area. The Tri-Cities is a very important urban area. Even Yakima and Wenatchee. All of these are more substantial, if you will, urban areas than exist in Eastern Oregon. I love Eastern Oregon, but there are no major cities in Eastern Oregon, and not. So there's a difference. There's a population difference that's significant. And that helps. I think that's a major reason, quite frankly. But I think from a statewide standpoint, electing a Republican governor is extraordinarily difficult. They've not elected a Republican senator since Slade Gorton lost to Maria Cantwell. So I would say, yes, the Republican Party is in better shape in Washington than it is in Oregon. But I would say that we're part of the left coast, no question about it. along with California. I don't see that changing because I think the demographics are all moving that direction.
Virginia Cornyn, City Club member. Mr. McKay, you did a wonderful job of summarizing successes in this state of bringing people together around issues that were arguably more clear than the issues of bias and the economic gaps and things. What would your top piece of advice be to Representative Frederick and Alissa Keny-Guyer and those who are dealing with the problems today as to how to approach these issues, which are far more emotionally and fear-based?
That's a tough question, and I don't know the answer to that, and I suspect that they're better equipped themselves to understand it than I will from the distance of Bellingham, Washington these days. I think that dialogue, continued dialogue, I like the idea. Back in the period I wrote about, one of the things the legislature used to do was to have interim committees between the sessions. I suspect that they still have, even though they may not call them interim committees. One of the things these committees would do would be to travel around the state and get an idea what was going on in the rest of part of the states. Well, the side benefit of that was that the members of the committee, Republicans and Democrats together, would find themselves housed together, eating together, drinking together, talking to local people together, and they got a better feel for the humanity of their colleagues. I don't know whether they still do that or not. I recommend almost anything that gets people off the legislative floor and working together and just learning about the humanity of each other. I've always found that almost every Oregon politician I ever dealt with was a very interesting person and people of integrity. But you had to get them in a situation where they weren't arguing a partisan view before you found these things out.
Well, one of the things that I've been very lucky about is because of Channel 8 is that we actually covered the rest of the state at one time, and so I got to all 36 counties. And since that time, I've been able to, as a legislator, I've managed to do a couple of tours of Eastern Oregon and go and sit down with the forest fire folks down in Southern Oregon and on the coast as well. So it's something that we all recognize. We do have committees. They don't necessarily tour as much as they used to, but the Ways and Means Committee does get out there, and you do get to have dinner and sit down and talk with folks.
I just want to add that I think that our relationships are a lot better than people might think they are in the Oregon legislature. I think we do have good relationships. We do work across the aisle. Lou is particularly good at reaching out to rural areas. And I think one of the signs of incredible unity in the Oregon House took place in the last 24 hours of the 2016 session when Representative Vic Gilliam from Silverton, who is suffering from Lou Gehrig's disease right now, carried a bill for the third time in a row to have the statue in National Statuary Hall be Mark Hatfield. And he had worked for him. And he ended up with, I think, 55 votes, very bipartisan support in the House. And even those that voted against it got up and said, well, they had promised they would vote against it to their constituents, but he's such a great guy. And, it was really, really good feeling. And we actually all went and did an Occupy the Senate because the Senate wasn't moving the bill. And it was a great show of solidarity. I have this funny joke about the minority leader, Mike McLean, looking at those of us from Portland going, oh, this protesting really feels good.
It was the first time many of them had ever been in a protest.
He's like, this is Occupy
I
the
must
Senate.
say that I have this image in my dream, and Bob, you'll laugh at this, of the two existing statues in Statue Hall being replaced by those eminent gentlemen, Tom McCall and Mark Hatfield, who thoroughly hated each other, forced to live into eternity in the same granite hall.
We are out of time unless y'all just want to quit work and hang out here today, which would be fun, but for OPB's sake alone, we must wrap it up. Thank you.
Yes, unfortunately, we're out of broadcast time. If this program has inspired you to join City Club today, you can do so at the table at the back of the room. As a reminder, Mr. McKay's book, Reporting the Oregon Story, will be available for purchase, and he can also sign it for you. I'm Courtney Nelson, president of City Club. Please join me in thanking our wonderful panel today, as well as Ed Hershey and Bobby Regan of the Friday Forum Committee. We're adjourned.